The square was packed shoulder to shoulder when Grace Bennet opened her mouth and changed the course of her entire life. She had not planned to say anything. She had come to Ashwick Hollow's central square only because her sister Lily had pulled her out of the house that morning, insisting that everyone in the village was required to attend the reading of the mating draft, and that staying home would only draw suspicion. Grace had rolled her eyes the whole walk over. She had no interest in kings, drafts, or the endless politics of packs that ruled from castles she would never see the inside of. She healed sick children and set broken bones. That was her whole world, and she liked it that way. But then the herald began to read the terms aloud, and something in Grace's chest went tight with anger she did not expect. The terms were simple, and they were cruel in their simplicity. Every unmated woman of a certain age within King Nathaniel Ashford's territory was to be recorded, ranked, and made available for consideration as a potential mate to the king himself, chosen not for love, but for the strength of her bloodline and the alliances her family could offer. It was dressed up in ceremonial language, wrapped in old traditions and old words, but underneath all of that, it was exactly what Grace called it a moment later, loud enough for the whole square to hear. A cattle auction, she said, for a man too proud to court someone properly. The words left her mouth before she could stop them, and for one terrible second, the entire square went silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Lily's hand clamped down hard on Grace's wrist, but it was too late. Heads had already turned. Whispers had already started, and somewhere near the front of the crowd, close enough that there was no chance he had not heard her, stood a man in a long gray coat, his eyes lifting slowly from the herald's scroll to find her face in the crowd. Grace did not know, in that moment, that she was looking at King Nathaniel Ashford himself. She only knew that the stranger's gaze was sharp enough to cut through stone, and that it had settled on her, and was not moving away. "Grace," Lily hissed under her breath, "do you have any idea what you just did?" "I said what everyone here is thinking," Grace whispered back, though her heart had begun to pound harder than she wanted to admit. Someone had to. Not out loud. Not here. Not in front of him. Grace turned, frowning. In front of who? Lily's face had gone pale, the color draining out of it the way it did whenever she was truly afraid, and Grace felt the first cold thread of dread work its way down her spine. She followed her sister's gaze back to the man in the gray coat, who had not looked away from her once, not even as the herald cleared his throat and tried, awkwardly, to continue reading. "That," Lily whispered, "is King Nathaniel." For a moment, Grace could not make herself believe it. She had heard stories about the Alpha King her whole life, stories that painted him as distant, cold, and untouchable, a man who ruled from behind stone walls and never lowered himself to walk among ordinary villagers. She had pictured him older, harsher, more obviously powerful in the way that soldiers and rulers were supposed to look. Instead, the man standing at the edge of the crowd looked barely older than she was, his dark hair pushed back from his face by the wind, his jaw set in an expression she could not quite read. Not anger, not amusement, something quieter and far more dangerous than either. She had insulted him, not behind his back, not in the safety of her own kitchen where such words were common enough among the village women. She had insulted him to his face, in front of half of Ashwick Hollow, and he had heard every single word. The herald, sensing the shift in the crowd's attention, tried valiantly to steer things back on course, raising his voice and continuing the reading of the draft as though nothing at all had happened. Names were called. Families were noted. The business of the ceremony rolled forward the way it always did, indifferent to the storm Grace had just caused. But nothing about the atmosphere in the square had returned to normal. People kept glancing toward her, then toward the king, then back again, as though watching to see what might happen next. What happened next was nothing at all. King Nathaniel did not approach her. He did not call for guards or demand an apology. He simply watched her for a long moment longer, his expression unreadable, before turning back to speak quietly with the man standing beside him, a broad-shouldered soldier Grace did not recognize. Then, without another glance in her direction, he turned and walked away from the square entirely, his gray coat disappearing between two buildings as easily as if the crowd had simply parted around him. Grace exhaled a breath she had not realized she was holding. "See," she said, forcing a note of confidence into her voice she did not entirely feel. "Nothing happened. He probably didn't even hear me properly." Lily did not look convinced. "He heard you. Everyone heard you. I could hear you 3 streets over." "Then he's clearly decided it isn't worth his time," Grace said, though even as the words left her mouth, she was not sure she believed them. There had been something in the way he looked at her, something that did not feel like a man who was choosing to forget an insult. It felt more like a man committing something carefully to memory. The rest of the reading passed without incident. Names continued to be called, Families continued to be noted, and slowly the crowd began to disperse, breaking apart into smaller groups that whispered and speculated as they walked back toward their homes. Grace kept her chin high the entire walk back, refusing to let anyone see how unsettled she actually felt. But the moment she and Lily were alone in their small kitchen, her carefully maintained composure cracked completely. "I shouldn't have said it," she admitted, sinking into a chair by the fire. "I know I shouldn't have." "No," Lily agreed, "you shouldn't have, but it's done now. All we can do is hope he has better things to worry about than one healer's daughter with an unfortunate mouth." Grace laughed, though there was little humor in it. "An unfortunate mouth. Is that what we're calling it now?" "It's what Mother would have called it, may she rest," Lily said. And for a moment, the two sisters shared a small, sad smile at the memory of their mother, who had possessed exactly the same sharp tongue, and exactly the same total inability to keep it in check when something struck her as unjust. As evening fell over Ashwick Hollow, Grace found herself standing at the window of her small bedroom, looking out over the darkening fields toward the distant tree line that marked the edge of Blackthorn territory. Somewhere beyond those trees stood the keep where King Nathaniel ruled, a place she had never seen and had never particularly wanted to see. She thought of the way he had looked at her in the square, the stillness of his expression, the way his eyes had not left her face even as the herald stumbled through his reading. She told herself it meant nothing. Kings had entire kingdoms to manage, alliances to maintain, wars to consider. Surely a single sharp remark from a village girl was beneath his notice, however uncomfortable the moment had been. Surely by morning he would have forgotten her face entirely, one voice lost among hundreds in a crowded square. She almost believed it. But sleep did not come easily that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face again, calm and unreadable, watching her the way a hunter watches something it has decided, quietly and without any particular hurry, that it intends to catch. And somewhere deep down, in the part of her mind she did not want to listen to, Grace understood that a king who ruled an entire territory through discipline and iron control did not become that king by forgetting insults easily. She was still awake when the first gray light of dawn began creeping over the horizon, and for reasons she could not entirely explain, she found herself dressing quietly and slipping down to the kitchen before anyone else in the house had woken. The village outside was still and silent, wrapped in the particular hush that settled over Ashwick Hollow just before the sun fully rose, when even the birds seemed to be holding their breath. It was in that silence that Grace first heard it, a sound like distant thunder, low and steady, rolling across the fields from the direction of the tree line. She stepped outside onto the small porch, frowning, straining to understand what she was hearing. It did not sound like thunder at all, not really. It sounded like hooves. Dozens of them, perhaps more than dozens. Her heart began to pound as the sound grew louder, closer, and shapes began to emerge from the mist clinging to the fields, riders in dark uniforms moving in tight, disciplined formation toward the village. At their center rode a figure in a long gray coat that Grace recognized instantly, a figure whose eyes, even from this distance, seemed to find her standing alone on her porch as easily as if she had been the only person in the world. Grace's mouth went dry. Whatever she had told herself the night before, whatever comfort she had tried to find in the idea that a king had better things to do than remember one village girl's insult, she understood now, with sudden and complete clarity, that she had been wrong. King Nathaniel Ashford had not forgotten her at all, and he had brought his entire army to make certain she would never forget him either. By the time the sun had fully risen, Ashwick Hollow was surrounded. Grace stood frozen on her porch as the riders spread out along the edge of the village, their formation tightening into a wall of dark uniforms and armored horses that made escape look impossible even for someone who had somewhere to run. Doors were opening up and down the street, villagers stumbling out in nightclothes, rubbing sleep from their eyes only to freeze at the sight of soldiers filling every road out of town. Children were being pulled back inside by frightened parents. Somewhere behind her she heard Lily's voice calling her name, sharp with panic, but Grace could not make herself move from where she stood. King Nathaniel dismounted at the edge of the square with unhurried precision, as though there was nowhere else on earth he needed to be, and the soldiers around him fell into position without a single word of command. It was the kind of discipline Grace had heard about in stories but had never seen with her own eyes, an entire company of armed men moving like a single creature at the will of one man. He walked forward through the gathering crowd of frightened villagers, and though he did not look directly at her, Grace understood, with the same cold certainty she had felt at dawn, that every step he took was leading toward her. Word spread through the village faster than the soldiers themselves had arrived. By the time Grace forced her legs to carry her down from the porch and into the square, half of Ashwick Hollow had already gathered there, murmuring among themselves. throwing glances between the king and the healer's daughter who had mocked him only a day before. Grace felt every one of those glances like a physical weight settling onto her shoulders. "This is my fault," she whispered to herself, though there was no one close enough to hear it except Lily, who had finally caught up to her, breathless and terrified. "Grace, what do we do?" "I don't know," Grace admitted, and it was the truest thing she had said all morning. King Nathaniel stopped a short distance away, close enough now that Grace could see the details she had missed the day before, the faint scar along his jaw, the tightness around his eyes that suggested exhaustion carefully hidden behind composure. He was not a monster, she realized distantly. He was simply a man who held enormous power and had decided, for reasons she still did not fully understand, that her words deserved a response measured in soldiers rather than silence. "Grace Bennet," he said, and his voice carried easily across the square despite its quiet, even tone. It was not a question. He already knew exactly who she was. Grace lifted her chin, refusing to let her fear show on her face even as her hands trembled at her sides. "Your Majesty," she said, forcing the words out with as much steadiness as she could manage. A murmur rippled through the crowd at the exchange, villagers pressing closer despite the danger, unable to look away from the confrontation unfolding in their own square. Grace was aware, distantly, of her neighbors watching, of the baker and the blacksmith and the old woman who sold herbs at the market, all of them witnessing what might be the last conversation she ever had as a free woman. "Do you know why I am here?" King Nathaniel asked. "I imagine," Grace said, "that it has something to do with what I said yesterday." Something flickered across his expression, too quick for Grace to name, gone before she could decide whether it had been anger or something else entirely. "You called my draft a cattle auction," he said, "in front of half your village, loudly enough that I imagine there are people in the next territory who heard you." "I said what I believed to be true," Grace answered, though her voice shook slightly on the last word. "I did not say it to be cruel. I said it because it was cruel, the way it treated women like property to be counted and ranked." Around them, the crowd had gone utterly silent, the kind of silence that felt as though the entire village was holding its breath at once. Grace was aware that she was, quite possibly, digging her own grave deeper with every word, but something stubborn in her refused to simply apologize for speaking a truth she still believed. King Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and when he finally spoke again, his words were not what Grace had expected at all. "You are not wrong," he said quietly. The crowd's silence deepened, if such a thing were possible. Even Lily, standing close beside Grace, seemed to have stopped breathing entirely. "I did not create the draft because I wished for it," King Nathaniel continued, his voice pitched low enough that only those closest could hear, though Grace suspected every word was deliberate, meant to be carried by whispers through the crowd regardless. "It was forced upon me by treaty obligations older than my own reign. I have hated it as much as you claim to hate it, perhaps longer." Grace blinked, thrown entirely off balance by an admission she had not expected a king to make in front of an entire village. "Then why?" she managed. "Did you bring an army to my home over a comment you agree with?" "Because," he said, and here his voice hardened slightly, taking on the edge of command she imagined he used far more often than the quiet honesty of a moment before. "Whatever my private feelings about the draft, it remains law, and you spoke against it publicly, which under that law cannot simply be ignored, whatever I might privately wish." "So you intend to punish me," Grace said, "for saying something you agree with?" "I intend," King Nathaniel said, "to resolve this in a manner that satisfies the law, without destroying either of us in the process. Whether you believe that or not is entirely your choice." Grace's mind raced, trying to understand what such a resolution could possibly look like, when soldiers already surrounded her village, and every villager watching seemed to expect nothing less than her arrest, or worse. "And what manner is that?" she asked carefully. "You will come with me," King Nathaniel said, "to Blackthorn Keep. There, under the terms of the very draft you mocked, you will fulfill the role you spoke against, for one full season. If, at the end of that season, the treaty's obligations are satisfied, you will be free to return here, to your village, with no further consequence to you or your family." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Grace felt her stomach drop entirely. "And if I refuse?" King Nathaniel's expression did not change, but something in his eyes did, a flicker of something that might have been regret, quickly suppressed. "Then the law requires a different resolution," he said quietly. "One considerably less kind to your village than to you personally." Grace understood, with sudden and terrible clarity, exactly what he meant. It was not truly a choice at all. refuse. And her neighbors, her sister, everyone she had grown up alongside, would pay a price for words that had come from her mouth alone. Agree, and she would be forced to leave everything she knew behind, to walk into a keep full of strangers and politics she did not understand, bound by obligations to a man whose army now surrounded her home. Grace, Lily whispered beside her, voice cracking. You don't have to. I do, Grace said quietly, cutting her sister off before the words could be finished. She turned back to King Nathaniel, forcing her voice to remain steady, despite the storm raging inside her chest. 1 season, she said, and then I return home, free, with my family untouched. You have my word, King Nathaniel said. Grace almost laughed at the absurdity of trusting the word of a man who had brought an entire army to her doorstep over a single sentence, but she swallowed the bitter sound before it could escape. Then I accept, she said, though I want it known, in front of everyone here, that I do this to protect my village, not because I believe your draft is just. Something in King Nathaniel's expression shifted again, something almost like respect flickering briefly behind the careful composure he wore like armor. Noted, he said simply. The soldiers began to withdraw their formation as arrangements were made, murmurs of relief spreading through the crowd as it became clear that no violence would come to Ashwick Hollow, that the king's army had arrived not to punish an entire village but to collect a single, unwilling participant in a political arrangement far larger than either Grace or the man who now claimed her for 1 season. As Grace turned to say her farewells to Lily, gathering what little she could carry for the journey ahead, she caught King Nathaniel watching her once more from across the square, his expression unreadable in the pale morning light. Whatever this arrangement truly was, whatever the treaty demanded of them both, Grace understood that she was about to step into a world far more complicated and far more dangerous than the quiet life she had known in Ashwick Hollow. And somewhere deep down, beneath the fear and the resentment simmering in her chest, a smaller, quieter part of her wondered exactly what kind of man she had just agreed to bind herself to for an entire season of her life. The road to Blackthorn Keep was longer than Grace had imagined, and every mile of it felt like a mile further from the only life she had ever known. She rode in a covered carriage provided by the king's soldiers, though calling it comfortable would have been generous. The wheels caught on every rut in the road, jolting her sideways against the hard wooden bench, and the small window let in only thin slivers of the passing countryside, fields giving way slowly to darker, denser forest, as the hours wore on. Across from her sat a young soldier named Captain Henry Cole, tasked, it seemed, with making certain she did not attempt to flee during the journey, though he had said barely a dozen words since they departed Ashwick Hollow. You don't have to guard me so closely, Grace finally said, breaking the silence somewhere past midday. I gave my word, I intend to keep it. Captain Cole glanced at her, something almost like amusement flickering across his otherwise stern face. Forgive me, miss, but you're the first person in the history of the draft to insult the king in front of half a village and then somehow talk your way into his personal carriage. Around here, we've learned not to assume anything where you're concerned. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she could not entirely tell if it was embarrassment or something closer to pride. So the whole territory is heard by now. The whole territory, Captain Cole confirmed, and likely several territories beyond it. News like that travels faster than any horse. Grace turned to look out the narrow window, watching the trees blur past in shades of deep green and shadow. She thought of Lily's face as she had said goodbye that morning, tears streaking silently down her cheeks despite her attempts to appear brave for her older sister's sake. She thought of her grandmother, too frail to leave her bed but sharp enough to grip Grace's hand tightly and whisper words of warning about the old wars, about kings who never truly forgot. She thought of the quiet, ordinary life she had built for herself as a healer, tending to cuts and fevers and broken bones, a life that now felt impossibly far away. What is he like? Grace asked, before she could stop herself. The king, truly. Captain Cole considered the question for a long moment, as though weighing how honest an answer he was permitted to give. Fair, he said eventually. Strict, but fair. He works harder than any man I've ever served under, and he expects the same of everyone around him. But he is not cruel, whatever you might have heard. Whatever the draft may look like from the outside, I do not believe he takes any pleasure in it. He said as much himself, Grace admitted. In the square. Said he hated it as much as I claimed to. Then he told you the truth, Captain Cole said simply, and something in the certainty of his tone made Grace reconsider, however slightly, the picture of King Nathaniel she had built in her mind since the moment she first mocked him. The carriage rattled onward through the afternoon, the forest thickening around them until the road narrowed to little more than a single lane cut through ancient trees whose branches met overhead, in a dark canopy that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. Grace found herself watching the shadows shift and move at the edges of the road, and more than once she was certain she caught glimpses of shapes moving parallel to the carriage, keeping pace easily despite the horse's steady trot. "Wolves," Captain Cole said, noticing her attention. "Scouts, mostly. Making certain the road ahead is clear before we arrive at the keep. They can move that fast?" "Faster," Captain Cole said, and something in his tone suggested he was choosing his words carefully, aware that Grace, coming from a village with little direct contact with pack politics, might not fully understand the nature of the world she was entering. The pack that serves King Nathaniel is old and disciplined. You'll see soon enough what that means. As the sun began to sink lower behind the trees, painting the narrow road in shades of deepening orange and gray, the forest finally began to thin, giving way to open fields that climbed steadily upward toward a ridge in the distance. And there, perched atop that ridge like something carved from the mountain itself, stood Blackthorn Keep. Grace had seen drawings of castles before, crude woodcuts in the few books her mother had owned, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer scale of the structure rising before her now, its dark stone walls catching the last light of the setting sun, towers stretching upward into a sky just beginning to darken toward evening, banners bearing the sigil of the Blackthorn pack, a wolf's head circled by thorned branches, hung motionless in the still evening air. The closer the carriage drew, the more Grace felt the weight of what she had agreed to settle fully onto her shoulders, heavier than it had felt standing in the square that morning, heavier than it had felt saying goodbye to Lily. "We'll arrive within the hour," Captain Cole said, noticing her expression. "I'd advise resting while you can. Once you're inside, you won't have much peace for a while yet. The court has already heard about you. They'll want to see for themselves what kind of woman speaks to the king the way you did." Grace swallowed hard, her earlier bravado feeling suddenly thin and fragile in the face of the looming keep ahead. And what kind of woman is that, in their eyes? Captain Cole's expression turned thoughtful, and for a moment, Grace thought he might not answer at all. "Honestly," he said finally, "I think that depends entirely on what you do once you're inside those walls. Some of them will want you to fail. A few, I imagine, will be hoping you don't." "And you?" Grace asked. "Which do you hope for?" A faint smile crossed the captain's face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "I hope," he said, "that whatever happens, it's interesting. It's been a long time since anything interesting happened at Blackthorn Keep." The carriage rattled on toward the looming gates, and Grace pressed her palm flat against the cool wood of the bench beneath her, steadying herself as best she could against the fear tightening in her chest. Whatever waited for her behind those ancient stone walls, whatever politics and rivalries and dangers the court held in store, she understood now that there was no turning back from the path she had chosen the moment she opened her mouth in that square. The gates of Blackthorn Keep groaned open as the carriage approached, torchlight flickering along the walls, and Grace caught her first glimpse of the courtyard beyond, filled with soldiers and servants who paused their evening tasks to watch the carriage roll past, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open suspicion. Somewhere among them, she knew, King Nathaniel was waiting, having ridden ahead of the carriage hours earlier to prepare for her arrival. She had mocked a king in front of half her village. Now she would spend an entire season living beneath his roof, bound by a treaty she had never asked to be part of, surrounded by a court that had already decided, before ever meeting her, exactly what they thought of the healer's daughter who dared to speak against their ruler. Grace straightened her spine as the carriage finally rolled to a stop within the courtyard, gathering every last scrap of courage she possessed. Whatever waited for her beyond those doors, she refused to walk into it looking anything less than exactly who she was. The moment Grace stepped down from the carriage, she understood that every eye in the courtyard had turned toward her at once. Servants paused mid-task, baskets of linen or firewood balanced forgotten in their arms. Soldiers standing guard along the walls shifted their weight, exchanging quiet glances with one another. And near the top of a wide stone staircase leading into the main hall of the keep, a small cluster of finely dressed men and women had gathered, watching her arrival with the particular sharpness of people who had spent their entire lives learning how to judge a stranger within seconds of meeting them. Grace lifted her chin and walked forward anyway. "Miss Bennet." A woman detached herself from the group at the top of the stairs and descended to meet her, moving with the kind of practiced grace that came from a lifetime spent in noble halls. She was perhaps a few years older than Grace, dressed in deep green silk that seemed to catch the torchlight with every small movement, her dark hair pinned into an elaborate style Grace had only ever seen in illustrations. "I am Charlotte Grant, the King's household steward. I will be seeing to your arrangements during your stay." "Thank you," Grace said, offering what she hoped was a polite nod despite the exhaustion pulling at every muscle in her body. I appreciate that someone here is willing to speak to me directly. Something flickered across Charlotte's expression, quick and difficult to read, before she offered a small, careful smile. Word travels quickly in a place like this, she said. By now, most of the court already has an opinion about you, whether they've met you or not. I find it wiser to form my own before listening to anyone else's. Grace felt a small measure of tension ease from her shoulders at those words, grateful for even a single ally in a place that already felt, after only a few minutes, thoroughly hostile to her presence. I'd like that, she said, an honest opinion, I mean, whatever it turns out to be. Charlotte's smile widened slightly, genuine this time. Come, she said, gesturing toward the stairs. Let's get you settled before the wolves start circling properly. As they climbed the stairs toward the main hall, Grace caught sight of the small cluster of nobles still watching from above, their expressions ranging from cold curiosity to something closer to open disdain. One man in particular stood apart from the others, tall and sharply dressed in dark blue, his pale eyes fixed on Grace with an intensity that made her skin prickle uncomfortably. Lord Edmund Whitlock, Charlotte murmured, following Grace's gaze. A cousin of the king's, several times removed, and one of the more vocal supporters of the draft in its original form. I'd advise caution around him. Noted, Grace said quietly, filing the name and face away carefully in her memory. They passed through the main hall, an enormous space with vaulted ceilings and long tables that would, Grace assumed, be filled with courtiers during formal meals, though tonight it stood mostly empty, lit only by scattered torches and the last fading light coming through tall, narrow windows. Charlotte led her down a smaller corridor branching off from the hall, past a series of closed doors, until finally stopping before one near the corridor's end. Your quarters, Charlotte said, pushing the door open to reveal a modestly sized room, simple but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a small writing desk, and a window overlooking what appeared to be a private garden below. Not as grand as some of the guest chambers, I'll admit, but the king specifically requested you be given a room with a view of the garden, said it might remind you of home, given your work as a healer. Grace blinked, surprised by the small, unexpected kindness buried within the request. He said that? He did, Charlotte confirmed, watching Grace's reaction carefully. For what it's worth, Miss Bennet, the king rarely concerns himself with the comfort of guests he considers unwilling. Make of that what you will. Before Grace could formulate a response to that particular observation, a soft knock sounded at the open door, and both women turned to find King Nathaniel himself standing in the corridor, still dressed in the same gray coat he had worn that morning in Ashwick Hollow, though it now looked slightly worn from the day's long ride. Charlotte, he said, offering the steward a small nod, if you wouldn't mind giving us a moment. Charlotte glanced briefly at Grace, as though silently checking whether she wished for the privacy, and Grace gave the smallest of nods in return, curiosity overtaking her earlier caution. Charlotte excused herself with a small bow, leaving Grace alone in the doorway with the man whose army had surrounded her village only that morning. You made good time, King Nathaniel said, breaking the silence first. Your Captain Cole was an excellent guide, Grace replied carefully, though I imagine that was rather the point of sending him. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of King Nathaniel's mouth, gone before Grace could be entirely certain she had seen it at all. I wanted to speak with you before the court has its chance, he said. Tomorrow, you will be presented formally. There will be questions, judgments, and no small amount of hostility, particularly from those who believe the draft exists to serve their own ambitions, rather than the treaty it was designed to satisfy. You mean Lord Whitlock, Grace said, watching carefully for his reaction. Something sharpened briefly in King Nathaniel's expression. You've already met him then. Only from a distance, Grace said. Charlotte warned me to be cautious. She's not wrong to, King Nathaniel said, his voice quieter now, more measured. Edmund has ambitions of his own regarding the draft, ambitions that have very little to do with treaties or alliances, and a great deal to do with strengthening his own position within this court. Your presence here complicates those ambitions considerably. Grace frowned, turning this new information over carefully. Because I mocked the very draft he supports. Because you mocked it, survived the consequences, and are now standing inside this keep, as living proof that the king himself is willing to bend the rigid terms of a tradition Edmund would prefer remained untouchable. King Nathaniel said, that makes you dangerous to him, whether you intend it or not. Grace let out a slow breath, the weight of the situation settling more fully onto her shoulders with every new detail she learned. I didn't ask to be dangerous to anyone, she said quietly. I only spoke what I believed. I know, King Nathaniel said, and something in the simple honesty of those two words caught Grace entirely off guard. That is precisely why I intend to make certain this season passes as smoothly as such an arrangement can. Whatever else this court believes about you, I would prefer you not suffer needlessly for words that, as I told you in the square, I largely agree with. Grace studied him carefully, searching his expression for any sign of insincerity, and finding none that she could identify. Why? She asked finally. Why does it matter to you what happens to me here? You could have simply let your soldiers drag me from my home this morning. Instead, you offered terms. Now you're standing in my doorway offering warnings about court politics. Most kings would never bother explaining to a commoner. King Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on hers in a way that made Grace's pulse quicken despite every ounce of caution she still held toward him. Perhaps, he said finally, I am simply tired of watching this draft cause harm to people who never asked to be part of it. Or perhaps, he added, his voice dropping lower, quieter, almost as though the words surprised even himself as he spoke them. There is something about the way you spoke in that square, the fire in it, that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. The admission hung in the air between them, unexpected and startling, and for a moment neither of them spoke at all, the quiet weight of it settling into the small space of the doorway. That is, King Nathaniel added quickly, straightening slightly, his composure sliding back into place like a mask, simply an observation. Rest well tonight, Miss Bennet. Tomorrow will require every bit of the courage you showed this morning. He turned and left before Grace could formulate any response at all, his footsteps fading quickly down the corridor, leaving her standing alone in the doorway of her new quarters, heart pounding for reasons she was no longer entirely certain had anything to do with fear. Whatever this season held in store for her, Grace understood, standing there in the flickering torchlight of Blackthorn Keep, that it would be far more complicated than simply surviving a hostile court. The great hall of Blackthorn Keep was filled to capacity by the time Grace arrived the following morning, and every single face turned toward her the moment she stepped through the towering doors. Charlotte had dressed her carefully that morning, choosing a simple gown of deep blue that Grace suspected had been selected specifically to avoid looking as though she were trying to imitate the nobility surrounding her, while still appearing presentable enough not to embarrass the king who had brought her here. Grace walked the long length of the hall toward the raised dais where King Nathaniel sat, flanked on either side by advisors and court officials, their expressions ranging from polite curiosity to open contempt. She spotted Lord Edmund Whitlock immediately, standing near the front of the gathered crowd, his pale eyes tracking her every step with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Grace Bennet, announced a herald standing near the dais, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall, healer of Ashwick Hollow, brought before this court under the terms of the mating draft, to fulfill the season required by treaty. A murmur rippled through the assembled nobles, and Grace forced herself to keep walking, keep her chin lifted, refusing to let the weight of so many judging eyes bow her posture even slightly. When she finally reached the base of the dais, she offered a careful bow, precise enough to satisfy formal expectations without appearing overly deferential. "Rise," King Nathaniel said, his voice carrying an authority Grace had not heard in their private conversation the night before. This was a different man standing before her now, a king addressing his court, rather than a stranger speaking quietly in a doorway. Grace rose, meeting his gaze steadily, and something passed between them, brief and unspoken, before King Nathaniel turned his attention back to the assembled court. "As many of you have already heard," he said, "Miss Bennet spoke publicly against the terms of the draft during its reading in Ashwick Hollow. Rather than allow such a challenge to go unanswered, I have brought her here to fulfill the very obligations she questioned, for the full duration required by treaty." "A generous solution," came a voice from the crowd, cool and deliberate, and Grace recognized it instantly as belonging to Lord Whitlock even before he stepped forward into full view. "Though I wonder, Your Majesty, whether generosity is truly what the situation calls for. The draft exists to secure alliances, to strengthen bloodlines vital to this territory's future. What alliance, precisely, does a village healer bring to this arrangement?" Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she forced herself to remain silent, aware that responding without invitation in front of the entire court would only worsen her position. "The alliance," King Nathaniel said, his voice remaining perfectly even despite the challenge, "of demonstrating that the law applies equally, regardless of birth or station." Miss Bennet spoke against the draft publicly. "The treaty demands a response to such a challenge. I have provided one that satisfies both the letter of that treaty and the principles this territory claims to uphold." Lord Whitlock's expression tightened, though he inclined his head slightly, apparently unwilling to push the challenge further in such a public setting. "Of course, Your Majesty," he said, though his eyes lingered on Grace with a coldness that promised the conversation was far from finished. The formal presentation continued for what felt to Grace like an unbearably long stretch of time, various court officials asking pointed questions about her background, her family, her intentions, each question carrying an undertone of suspicion that made clear exactly how unwelcome her presence truly was among most of those gathered. Grace answered each question as honestly and steadily as she could manage, refusing to let her voice waver even as the questions grew sharper, more pointed, clearly designed to expose some weakness or contradiction in her position. Finally, King Nathaniel raised a hand, calling an end to the formal questioning. "Miss Bennet will be treated as a guest of this court for the duration of her season here," he announced. "I expect every member of this household to extend her the same courtesy they would show any other guest under this roof." The words carried clear warning beneath their formal phrasing, and Grace noted the way several nobles exchanged glances at the implicit command, understanding perhaps better than she did herself exactly how unusual it was for the king to issue such a direct instruction on behalf of a commoner. As the court began to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves, Charlotte appeared quietly at Grace's side, guiding her away from the dais and toward a quieter corner of the hall. "That went about as well as could be expected," Charlotte said quietly, once they were out of easy earshot of the departing nobles. "Lord Whitlock doesn't seem to agree," Grace said, glancing back toward where the tall nobleman still stood, deep in quiet conversation with two other courtiers, all three of them glancing occasionally in her direction. "Lord Whitlock rarely agrees with anything that doesn't directly serve his own ambitions," Charlotte said. "Pay him no mind for now. He'll need time to determine exactly how he intends to use your presence here against you, and that gives us time to make certain you're prepared for whatever he attempts." Grace appreciated the steward's directness, though it did little to ease the knot of tension sitting heavily in her stomach. "Is it always like this?" she asked. "This much politics, over something as simple as a marriage arrangement?" Charlotte's expression turned thoughtful. "Little here is ever simple, Miss Bennet. The draft may sound like a matter of marriage on paper, but in practice, it touches every alliance, every rivalry, every ambition within this territory, and several neighboring ones besides. You've stepped into the middle of currents that have been shifting long before you ever opened your mouth in that square." Grace sighed, rubbing her temple where a headache had begun to form somewhere during the endless questioning. "I only wanted to heal people," she murmured. "Set bones, treat fevers. I never wanted any of this." "I believe that," Charlotte said, her voice softening slightly. "For what it's worth, most of the household staff believe it too. It's the nobility you'll need to convince, and that will take considerably more than good intentions." As the days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm, Grace found herself observing the court carefully, learning names and faces, alliances and rivalries, piecing together the complicated web of relationships that governed life within Blackthorn Keep. She spent her mornings assisting the keep's own healer, a kind but overworked older woman named Margaret, grateful for the familiar comfort of useful work amid the unfamiliar tension of court life. Her afternoons were spent, more often than not, in quiet conversation with King Nathaniel, ostensibly to discuss the practical arrangements of her season at the keep, though Grace noticed those conversations growing steadily longer, steadily less formal, with each passing day. She noticed, too, the way Lord Whitlock's gaze followed her through the halls, patient and calculating, waiting for an opportunity Grace understood. With growing unease, he fully intended to create for himself. Whatever peace Grace found in her small routines at the keep, she understood it was only a matter of time before that patient, calculating gaze translated into action. The letter arrived on a quiet afternoon nearly 3 weeks into Grace's season at Blackthorn Keep, slipped beneath her door sometime while she had been assisting Margaret in the healer's chambers, and its contents sent a cold wave of fear through her chest the moment she read them. The handwriting was unfamiliar, deliberately disguised, but the message itself was clear enough. It claimed to know the truth about Grace's family, hinting darkly at debts owed by her late father that had never been properly settled. Debts that, if made public, could ruin what remained of her family's standing in Ashwick Hollow, and potentially implicate her in matters far more serious than a public insult toward the king. The letter demanded, in exchange for silence, that Grace formally withdraw from the draft, publicly declaring herself unfit to fulfill the treaty's obligations, humiliating herself before the entire court rather than risk her family's reputation. Grace read the letter 3 times before sitting down heavily on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling slightly as the full weight of the threat settled over her. She knew, without needing to see a signature, exactly whose ambitions lay behind such a carefully constructed threat. She found Charlotte first, unwilling to bring such an accusation directly to the king without first understanding whether the claims held any truth at all. "My father never had debts," Grace said quietly, once she had shown Charlotte the letter in the privacy of her quarters. "He was careful with money his whole life. Whoever wrote this is lying." Charlotte studied the letter carefully, her expression darkening with each line. "Lies built carefully enough can do just as much damage as truth, particularly when spread through a court already inclined to distrust you," she said. "This has Whitlock's fingerprints all over it, even without a signature. He's patient, and this is exactly the kind of quiet pressure he prefers, rather than open confrontation." "What do I do?" Grace asked, fear creeping steadily into her voice despite her attempts to remain composed. "If this spreads through the court, even as a rumor, it could ruin my sister's chances of ever marrying well in the village. It could ruin everything my mother worked to build." Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her next words carefully. "You could go to the king," she said finally. "He deserves to know regardless, and he has resources to investigate such claims far beyond anything either of us could manage alone." Grace hesitated, old instincts warning her against relying too heavily on a king whose court had already made its hostility toward her abundantly clear. "And if he decides the risk to his own reputation outweighs the trouble of defending mine, then you will have lost nothing you did not already stand to lose," Charlotte said gently. "But I do not believe that is what will happen, Grace. Not from what I have observed these past weeks." Grace found King Nathaniel later that evening in his private study, a smaller, quieter room lined with books and maps that felt worlds away from the cold formality of the great hall. He looked up from a stack of papers as she entered, his expression shifting quickly to concern the moment he took in the tightness of her posture. "What's happened?" he asked, setting aside his work immediately. Grace handed him the letter without a word, watching his expression carefully as he read through its contents. She saw the moment his jaw tightened, the moment his eyes narrowed with something far colder than mere irritation. "This is Whitlock's work," he said, echoing Charlotte's assessment without hesitation. "There's no signature," Grace said. "How can you be certain?" "Because this is precisely the kind of quiet cruelty he has always favored," King Nathaniel said, setting the letter down on his desk with deliberate care, as though controlling the urge to crumple it entirely. "He learned long ago that open confrontation rarely serves his interests. He prefers pressure applied where it cannot easily be traced back to him." "He's threatening my family," Grace said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Over debts my father never had." "I will have this investigated immediately," King Nathaniel said. "Whatever claims this letter makes, I promise you, they will not go unanswered, nor will the person responsible for writing it." Grace studied him carefully, searching for any sign of hesitation, any indication that he might, despite his words, ultimately choose the easier path of allowing her to withdraw quietly, rather than risk further conflict with a powerful member of his own court. She found none. "Why?" she asked again, the same question she had asked him weeks before in the doorway of her quarters, though this time her voice carried less suspicion and more genuine curiosity. "Why does my family's reputation matter enough to you to risk conflict with your own cousin?" King Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on hers in the flickering candlelight of the study. "Because you came here under terms I set myself," he said finally. "Because whatever began as a matter of law between us has become, over these past weeks, something I find myself unwilling to see damaged by a man whose only true concern is his own advancement. And because," he added, his voice dropping lower, quieter, carrying a weight Grace had not heard from him before, "I find that I care a great deal more about what happens to you than either of us, I think, expected when this began." The admission settled heavily in the quiet study, and Grace found herself unable to look away from him, the careful distance she had maintained since her arrival at the keep beginning, slowly and against her better judgment, to erode entirely. "I don't know what to do with that," Grace admitted quietly. "Neither, if I am honest, do I," King Nathaniel said, a faint, rueful smile touching his mouth. "But for now, let us focus on Whitlock. Whatever grows between us, it will mean little if this court succeeds in tearing your family apart first." Grace nodded, grateful for the shift back toward practical matters even as her heart continued to pound from the weight of his earlier words. "What will you do?" "I will have my own investigators look into the claims about your father's finances immediately," King Nathaniel said. "And I will speak with Edmund directly, making clear that such tactics will not be tolerated within this court, regardless of his standing as my cousin." "He'll only find another way," Grace said quietly. "Men like him always do." "Perhaps," King Nathaniel admitted, But he will know, at least, that I am watching closely enough to catch the next attempt far sooner than this one. As Grace left the study that evening, the letter safely in King Nathaniel's possession, she found herself walking the quiet corridors of Blackthorn Keep, with a strange new weight settled in her chest, equal parts fear for what Lord Whitlock might attempt next, and something else entirely, something warmer and far more complicated, tied inexorably now to the man whose army had once surrounded her village, and who now seemed determined to defend her against threats she had never expected to face within these ancient stone walls. Whatever Lord Whitlock intended next, Grace understood she would not be facing it alone. The investigation moved faster than Grace expected, and within a week, King Nathaniel summoned her once again to his private study, this time with news that settled the anxious knot in her chest, at least partially, for the first time since the threatening letter had arrived. "Your father's finances were entirely in order," he told her, sliding a small stack of documents across the desk toward her. "No debts, no outstanding claims, nothing beyond the ordinary accounts any village healer might have kept. The letter was fabricated entirely, built from nothing more than assumptions Whitlock hoped you would be too frightened to question." Relief flooded through Grace so suddenly her knees felt momentarily unsteady, and she gripped the edge of the desk for support. "Then it's over," she said. "He failed." "This particular attempt failed," King Nathaniel corrected gently. "But men like Edmund rarely stop after a single setback. If anything, I suspect this will only make him more careful, more patient, in whatever he attempts next." Grace absorbed this with a slow, steadying breath, grateful nonetheless for even a temporary reprieve. "Will you confront him about it?" "I already have," King Nathaniel said, his expression darkening slightly at the memory. He denied any involvement, of course, though his denial was considerably less convincing than he likely believes. "I have made it clear, in no uncertain terms, that any further attempts to threaten you or your family will be treated as a direct challenge to my authority as king, not merely a private grievance against a commoner he considers beneath his notice." "That's a bold thing to say about your own cousin," Grace observed. "Edmund has always believed his blood ties to my family entitle him to influence. He has not earned through merit," King Nathaniel said, something weary entering his voice. "This will not be the first time I have needed to remind him otherwise, though I suspect, given the stakes involved this time, it may prove considerably more difficult to make the lesson stick." News of the confrontation spread through the court within days, whispered between servants and nobles alike, and Grace noticed a subtle shift in how she was treated as a result. Where before she had received cold stares and pointed questions, now she found herself the subject of quieter, more careful observation. Courtiers uncertain how to categorize a commoner the king himself had chosen to defend so openly against a member of his own family. Lord Whitlock, for his part, made no further direct attempts against her in the weeks that followed, though Grace often caught his cold, calculating gaze following her through the halls, patient as ever, clearly biding his time for a more opportune moment to strike. It was during this uneasy calm that Grace found herself spending more and more time in King Nathaniel's company, their conversations drifting gradually away from the formal business of treaties and political threats toward something far more personal. She learned, during long evenings in his study, that he had become king far younger than he had ever expected, his father's sudden death thrusting the full weight of Blackthorn's rule onto his shoulders before he had properly finished his own training. She learned that the draft itself had been a treaty obligation inherited from that same father, a promise made decades earlier to secure peace with a neighboring territory, one Nathaniel had never agreed with but had felt bound to honor regardless. In turn, Grace found herself sharing stories of her own childhood in Ashwick Hollow, of learning healing skills at her mother's side, of the quiet satisfaction she found in mending what could be mended and easing what could not. She spoke of Lily, of her grandmother's fading health, of the simple, ordinary dreams she had once held for her future, dreams that had never once included castles or crowns or the complicated politics of pack alliances. "You miss it," King Nathaniel observed one evening, watching her carefully across the quiet study. "Your old life." "Every day," Grace admitted, "though I find myself missing it slightly less than I expected to, given the circumstances." Something warm flickered across his expression at that admission, quickly suppressed but not quickly enough to escape her notice entirely. "I confess," he said, "that I find myself dreading the day your season here concludes, rather more than I anticipated when I first proposed the arrangement." Grace's heart quickened at the admission, though she forced herself to respond carefully, aware of exactly how complicated such feelings remained, given the circumstances that had brought them together in the first place. "You dread it because the treaty demands a resolution you're not certain you'll be satisfied with," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she suspected they were not entirely true. Perhaps, King Nathaniel said quietly. I dread it because I have come to value your presence here for reasons that have very little to do with treaties at all. The confession hung between them, quiet and weighty, and Grace found herself unable to look away from him, the careful distance she had maintained since her arrival, eroding further with every passing week they spent in each other's company. This complicates things considerably, Grace said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It does, King Nathaniel agreed, though I find increasingly that I do not mind the complication nearly as much as logic suggests I should. Before either of them could explore the implications of such an admission any further, a sharp knock interrupted the quiet study, and Charlotte entered looking distinctly troubled, a folded letter clutched tightly in her hand. Your Majesty, she said, her voice carrying an urgency that immediately banished the warmth from the room. There's news from the northern border. Lord Whitlock has requested an emergency session of the full court, first thing tomorrow morning. He claims to have evidence that Miss Bennet's presence here violates the original terms of the treaty entirely. Grace felt her stomach drop, the fragile peace of the evening shattering instantly at the news. King Nathaniel's expression hardened immediately, all trace of the earlier warmth replaced by the sharp, calculating focus of a king preparing for battle. Then we will need to prepare carefully, he said, rising from his desk with sudden purpose. Whatever Edmund believes he has found, we cannot afford to walk into that session unprepared. Grace nodded, steadying herself against the fear threatening to overwhelm her once more, aware that whatever fragile progress they had made toward something real and true between them would need to wait until this newest threat had been properly addressed. The great hall was tense with anticipation the following morning, every seat filled long before King Nathaniel took his place upon the dais, Grace standing carefully composed beside Charlotte near the front of the assembled crowd, her heart pounding steadily despite her attempts to appear calm. Lord Whitlock stood near the center of the hall, flanked by two other nobles Grace recognized from earlier weeks as some of his closest allies within the court, a rolled document held carefully in his hands, as though it were a weapon he intended to wield with precision. Your Majesty, Whitlock began, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall, I bring before this court evidence I believe demands immediate attention. The original treaty establishing the mating draft specifies clearly that candidates must come from families holding recognized standing within the territory's registered bloodlines. I have here documentation proving that Miss Bennet's family holds no such registered standing, rendering her participation in this draft, however well-intentioned, a direct violation of the treaty's original terms. Murmurs rippled through the assembled court, and Grace felt her stomach tighten with dread, uncertain whether such a claim held any legal weight or whether it was simply another carefully constructed attack designed to look legitimate. King Nathaniel's expression remained carefully neutral as he accepted the document Whitlock offered, studying it with the same measured focus Grace had come to associate with his most serious deliberations. This document, he said finally, references bloodline registrations compiled nearly 60 years ago, Edmund. Are you certain you wish to argue that a treaty's terms should be bound by records over half a century outdated? A flicker of uncertainty crossed Whitlock's face, quickly suppressed. The treaty specifies registered bloodlines, Your Majesty. It does not specify a particular date for such registration. No, King Nathaniel agreed, it does not. Which is precisely why my own advisors reviewed the treaty's full text last evening, anticipating exactly this kind of challenge. He gestured, and an older man Grace did not recognize stepped forward from among the gathered advisors, carrying a considerably thicker stack of documents than the single sheet Whitlock had presented. This is Master Aldrich Payne, King Nathaniel explained, chief archivist of this keep, and the foremost authority on treaty law within this territory. Master Payne, would you care to clarify the matter of bloodline registration for the benefit of the court? The older man bowed slightly before addressing the hall directly. The treaty's original language, he said, his voice carrying the precise, careful tone of a man who had spent decades studying such documents, requires only that candidates descend from families recognized as residents within the territory's bounds at the time of the draft's reading, not that such families appear on any particular historical registry. Miss Bennet's family has resided in Ashwick Hollow for 3 generations, a fact easily verified through the village's own local records, which I took the liberty of reviewing myself only this morning. A fresh wave of murmurs swept through the hall, and Grace watched Whitlock's expression tighten further, his earlier confidence rapidly draining away, as the foundation of his challenge crumbled beneath careful scrutiny. This is a matter of interpretation, Whitlock protested, though his voice had lost much of its earlier conviction. It is a matter of clearly documented legal precedent, Master Payne countered evenly. established through similar rulings on no fewer than 4 previous occasions within this territory's history. I would be happy to provide the full documentation to the court, should further verification be required. King Nathaniel turned back toward the assembled hall, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority now. This court has heard the evidence, he said. Miss Bennet's participation in the draft satisfies every requirement set forth by the original treaty, verified through legal precedent and historical record alike. I would remind everyone present that further challenges brought before this court without proper foundation reflect poorly not on the person being challenged, but on the one bringing the challenge forward. The words landed with clear, unmistakable force, and Grace watched as several of the nobles who had gathered near Whitlock earlier began, subtly but unmistakably, to distance themselves from his position, unwilling to be associated with a challenge that had just been so thoroughly dismantled before the entire court. Whitlock, recognizing the shifting tide against him, offered a stiff, formal bow toward the dais. "Of course, Your Majesty," he said, though the coldness in his eyes as he glanced briefly toward Grace suggested his resentment had only deepened rather than faded with this latest defeat. As the court session drew to its close and the assembled nobles began filtering out of the great hall, murmuring amongst themselves about the dramatic reversal they had just witnessed, Grace found herself approached by several courtiers who had previously kept a careful, suspicious distance, their expressions now carrying something closer to grudging respect. "That was well handled," Charlotte murmured, appearing at her side once the hall had mostly emptied. Whitlock overplayed his hand this time, and the king made certain the entire court saw it happen. Grace nodded, though the relief she felt was tempered by an uneasy awareness that a man like Whitlock, humiliated so thoroughly before his peers, was unlikely to simply accept defeat and move on quietly. "He won't stop," she said, "not after this." "No," Charlotte agreed. "If anything, I suspect this will push him toward something far more drastic than fabricated letters or questionable legal challenges." Grace glanced toward the dais, where King Nathaniel remained deep in quiet conversation with Master Payne, his expression thoughtful and slightly troubled despite the clear victory the morning had brought. When he finally caught her gaze across the emptying hall, something passed between them, unspoken but understood, an acknowledgement that whatever peace this small triumph had bought them, it was almost certainly temporary. The season Grace had agreed to fulfill was drawing steadily closer to its conclusion, and with every challenge they overcame together, she found herself increasingly uncertain whether she wanted that season to end at all. Barely 3 days after the emergency court session, Grace was summoned late one evening to the healer's chambers, where Margaret informed her, breathless and worried, that a message had arrived from Ashwick Hollow, carrying urgent news about her sister. The message claimed that Lily had fallen seriously ill and required Grace's immediate presence, along with specific herbs that could only be gathered from a particular grove near the edge of Blackthorn territory, a location Grace was instructed to reach quietly and alone, before dawn, to ensure the herbs remained fresh enough to be effective. Something about the message struck Grace as immediately wrong, though her fear for Lily's well-being made it difficult to think clearly. She brought the letter directly to Charlotte, whose expression darkened the moment she read through its contents. "This isn't your sister's handwriting," Charlotte said carefully. "I've seen letters Lily sent you before. This is close, but not quite right, and no messenger from Ashwick Hollow would know to request herbs from that particular grove. It's remote, dangerous terrain, well outside any route a legitimate messenger would suggest." Grace's blood ran cold as the implications settled over her. "You think this is Whitlock?" "I think," Charlotte said grimly, "that after his humiliation before the court, he has decided a more direct approach is required. This letter is designed to lure you outside the keep's protection, alone, before anyone realizes you've gone." Grace's hands trembled as she considered the possibilities, torn between genuine fear that something might truly be wrong with Lily, and growing certainty that the letter was exactly the trap Charlotte suspected. "We need to tell the king," she said finally. They found King Nathaniel already awake, reviewing reports by candlelight in his study, and his expression turned to controlled fury the moment he read through the fabricated letter. "This is precisely the kind of drastic action I feared he might attempt," he said. "If you had left the keep alone tonight, following this letter's instructions, there is no telling what might have happened to you before anyone realized you were missing." "What do we do?" Grace asked, fear and anger warring equally within her chest. "We confirm your sister's safety immediately," King Nathaniel said, already moving toward the door, "and then we determine exactly how far Edmund is willing to go to remove you from this draft permanently." A rider was dispatched within the hour to Ashwick Hollow, and while they waited anxiously through the remainder of the night for confirmation, King Nathaniel's own investigators began quietly tracing the letter's origins, following threads of ink and paper stock back toward a private study within the keep itself, one belonging, unmistakably, to Lord Whitlock. By morning, the writer returned with word that Lily was perfectly healthy, utterly bewildered by news of any supposed illness, confirming beyond doubt exactly what Grace and Charlotte had already suspected. The fabricated letter had been designed for one purpose alone: to draw Grace outside the protection of Blackthorn Keep under cover of darkness, toward a remote location where anything might have happened to her without witnesses or warning. King Nathaniel summoned Whitlock before a smaller, more private assembly of the court's highest-ranking officials that same morning, the fabricated letter laid out plainly upon the table before them, alongside evidence tracing its origins directly back to Whitlock's own private study. "You have gone too far this time, Edmund," King Nathaniel said, his voice carrying a cold fury Grace had not heard from him before, not even during their first confrontation in Ashwick Hollow. Fabricated letters designed to threaten a woman's family were one matter. This is an attempt to lure her into danger under false pretenses regarding her own sister's health. That is not political maneuvering. That is a direct threat against her life. Whitlock's composure finally cracked under the weight of evidence too thorough to deny convincingly. "She threatens everything this territory stands for," he said, his voice rising with barely controlled anger. "A commoner, elevated through nothing more than a moment of reckless speech, now positioned to influence the very throne itself. I did what I believed necessary to protect this territory's future." "You did what you believed necessary to protect your own ambitions," King Nathaniel corrected sharply. "And in doing so, you have revealed exactly the kind of danger this court has tolerated within its own ranks for far too long." The consequences that followed were swift and severe. Whitlock stripped of his standing within the court and confined to his estates pending further judgment, his allies among the nobility quick to distance themselves entirely from a scheme that had crossed so clearly from political rivalry into genuine danger. Grace watched the proceedings with a strange, hollow feeling, relief mixed with a lingering unease at how close she had come, unknowingly, to walking straight into whatever trap Whitlock had prepared for her in that remote grove. That evening, King Nathaniel found her alone in the small garden beneath her window, staring quietly up at the stars scattered across the clear night sky. "You could have been killed," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her, "if Charlotte had not questioned that letter, if you had simply followed its instructions out of fear for your sister." "But I didn't," Grace said, turning to face him. "Because of you, and Charlotte, and everyone here who chose to look closer rather than simply accept things at face value." King Nathaniel studied her carefully in the moonlight, something raw and unguarded finally breaking through the careful composure he had maintained for so many weeks. "When I received word of that letter," he said, his voice rougher than Grace had ever heard it, "I have never in my life felt fear the way I felt it in that moment, imagining what might have happened to you alone in those woods." Grace's breath caught at the rawness of the admission, and before she fully understood what was happening, she found herself closing the small distance between them, King Nathaniel's hand rising gently to cup her face, his thumb tracing softly along her cheek. "I came to this keep as a punishment," Grace whispered, "for words I never regretted speaking. I never expected to find anything here worth staying for." "And now?" King Nathaniel asked quietly, his voice barely more than a breath in the quiet night air. "Now," Grace admitted, "I find myself terrified of the season ending at all." The distance between them closed entirely, and beneath the quiet stars of Blackthorn Keep's private garden, whatever remained of the careful boundaries they had both maintained, finally, fully, gave way. The final day of Grace's season at Blackthorn Keep arrived with the entire court gathered once more in the great hall, tension thick enough that Grace could feel it pressing against her skin the moment she stepped through the towering doors. According to the treaty's original terms, this was the day the obligation would formally conclude, the day Grace would either be released to return home to Ashwick Hollow, her family standing fully protected, or the day some further resolution would need to be declared before the assembled court. She had spent the previous night unable to sleep, her mind turning over and over the quiet words she and King Nathaniel had exchanged in the garden weeks before, words that had grown, in the time since, into something far deeper than either of them had anticipated when this arrangement first began. Lord Whitlock's absence from the hall was notable, his estate still under quiet confinement following the events of the past weeks, and Grace noticed several of his former allies among the nobility watching the proceedings today with considerably more caution than open hostility, uncertain how to position themselves now that the political ground beneath them had shifted so dramatically. King Nathaniel rose from his seat upon the dais as the hall settled into silence, his gaze finding Grace immediately among the gathered crowd, steady and sure in a way that eased, at least partially, the anxious tightness in her chest. 3 months ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. Grace Bennet stood before a crowd in Ashwick Hollow and spoke against a tradition she believed was cruel. A draft that reduced women to little more than names on a list, ranked and selected without any true consideration of choice or love. She spoke without knowing I stood among that crowd, without knowing her words would bring an army to her village at dawn. Murmurs rippled through the hall at the reminder of how this entire arrangement had begun, and Grace felt every eye once again settling upon her, though this time, she noticed, the weight of those gazes felt different, curious rather than purely hostile. I brought her here, King Nathaniel continued, under the strict terms of a treaty I myself had long resented, believing that fulfilling its obligations would satisfy the law without further complication. I did not anticipate when I made that decision exactly how thoroughly my own understanding of this draft and of what I truly wanted from my future would change over the course of these 3 months. Grace's heart pounded as she listened, uncertain exactly where his words were leading, though something in his expression, steady and certain despite the formal weight of the setting, filled her with a cautious, growing hope. The treaty required only that I select a mate from among the candidates presented through this draft, a decision meant to satisfy political alliance rather than personal choice, King Nathaniel continued. I intend, before this court and before the terms of that same treaty, to satisfy that requirement fully. But I do so not because law demands it, nor because ambition or alliance requires it. I do so because, over these past months, I have come to believe there is no one within this territory, or any other, I would rather stand beside as both king and mate. He descended from the dais then, crossing the length of the great hall until he stood directly before Grace, the entire court watching in rapt, breathless silence. Grace Bennet, he said, his voice softer now, meant for her alone despite carrying easily through the silent hall. You came here mocking a draft you believed reduced choice to obligation. I am asking you now, standing before everyone who once doubted you, to make a choice entirely your own. Will you stay, not as an obligation fulfilled, but as the mate I have chosen freely, and hope with everything in me that you will choose in return? Grace felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, the weight of the past 3 months, the fear and uncertainty and slow, unexpected discovery of something real beneath all the politics and danger, finally settling into a single, clear moment of decision. I came here believing I was walking into a punishment, she said, her voice carrying steadily despite the tears threatening to spill over. I leave here, if I choose to leave at all, having found something I never expected, something worth staying for entirely on my own terms. She reached out, taking his offered hand in front of the entire assembled court. I choose to stay, she said, not because of any treaty, and not because any army once surrounded my village. I choose you, freely, exactly as you asked. The hall erupted into a mixture of applause and astonished murmuring. Courtiers who had once viewed Grace with open suspicion, now watching the scene unfold with something closer to genuine wonder at the transformation they had witnessed over the course of a single season. In the months that followed, Grace settled fully into her new life at Blackthorn Keep, no longer a reluctant guest fulfilling treaty obligations but a chosen partner, standing openly beside King Nathaniel as both advisor and equal. She continued her work as a healer alongside Margaret, insisting that her new position within the court changed nothing about the skills and purpose she had carried with her from Ashwick Hollow. Lily visited often, marveling at how thoroughly her sister's life had transformed from the quiet, ordinary existence they had once shared in their small village home. Lord Whitlock's schemes, thoroughly exposed and firmly dismantled, left him with little remaining influence within a court that had watched, season after season, as the very woman he had tried so hard to remove instead became one of its most respected voices. And King Nathaniel, who had once ridden to Ashwick Hollow at dawn with an army at his back, found that the true resolution to his obligations under an old and unwanted treaty had come not through force or law, but through the simple, unexpected discovery of someone whose fire matched his own, someone who had mocked his draft before ever meeting him, and had, in doing so, changed the entire course of both their lives. Grace Bennet, who had once called the mating draft a cattle auction before an entire village, stood now beside the king she had mocked, no longer a reluctant participant in obligations she never chose, but a queen who had, through her own courage and honesty, transformed the very tradition she had once condemned into something built, finally, on genuine choice.